John 12:27. I am troubled now, yet what should I say? Father, save me from this hour. But it was for this purpose that I came this hour. So in this moment, it's Jesus talking. These are the words of Jesus, and basically Jesus was troubled because he knew that, his death, it was near. And he knew what the agonies of the cross would involve. He knew that dying on the cross would not be easy. It would take a lot of strength, and he would go through a lot of pain. So I would be troubled too if I was in that position, if I knew I was going to die, and if I knew how painful it would be. So Jesus was troubled because he knew his death was near, and that he knew his death wasn't going to be easy. He was going to have a hard time on the cross. But he knew that this was the purpose for why God had sent him in the first place, for this crucial hour. And so, in the midst of his fear, he revoked his previous thought. Instead of thinking, God, save me from this hour, he reminded himself that this was the reason that he was sent. So he revoked his previous thought, and he rerouted his brain to the right thing. He rejected the thought that went against God. And that is exactly what we should do. We should strive to reject any thoughts that go against God and his will. And I believe that there's a Bible verse in the Bible that says exactly that. To push down any thoughts that stand itself against God. That is a verse in the Bible. I don't remember which one, but I know it is. And so we should strive to reject any thoughts that go against God and his will. In the end, God's will always prevail, no matter what we do. But not surrendering to God's will can lead to a path of discontentment. It can lead to a lack of peace and fulfillment, because when we don't conform to God's will, we're just going off our own will. And going off of our own will never make us feel fulfilled. It will never satisfy us. When we surrender to God's will, it's not easy to surrender to God's will. Of course it isn't. It isn't easy to surrender to God's will because sometimes we have to make sacrifices for God's will. Sometimes we will know that we have to sacrifice things to be able to follow God and his will. But those things, sacrificing yourself for God's will always be worth it. When Lazarus had died and Jesus had raised him from the dead, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Jesus, and I think there were other people there, but they held a feast, they held a dinner, and Mary anointed Jesus' feet. Mary anointed the feet of Jesus with perfumed oil, and she dried his feet with her hair. That perfumed oil was probably so expensive, but she made that sacrifice so that she could anoint the feet of Jesus. And believe it or not, in that time, Jewish women, they normally didn't let down their hair, but Mary did, so that she could dry the feet of Jesus. And so she made 2 sacrifices in that instant just for Jesus, so that she could anoint his feet. And in the end, the house ended up smelling like perfumed oil. Good. It ended up smelling good and fragrant. And that just shows that when we make sacrifices for God's will, the result is always positive. It's worth it for Jesus. And not surrendering to God's will can lead to a lack of peace and fulfillment, just because of what I said earlier, following your own personal plans and your own personal will Your own way of life will never satisfy you, but following and surrendering to God's will satisfy you. And of course, when you follow Jesus, you will have an abundant life. But abundant life doesn't mean an easy, comfortable life. Abundant life means a life lived with Jesus that will result in peace and in joy, but you will have to make sacrifices on the way, and you will have to go through tribulation and struggles. But they will all be worth it for Jesus, because in the end, you will reap what you sow. You will reap what you sow. If you sow good, then you will reap good. And so, God's will can be hard to surrender to. And it's important to know that we have to make sacrifices in order to surrender to His will. But it's also important to know that when we surrender to God's will, surrendering to God's will brings peace, joy, fulfillment, purpose. And amongst all of that, it also brings a beautiful relationship with God. And nothing can top that. So, we should strive to reject any thoughts that go against God and His will. Even if it's fear. Even if it's fear to make sacrifices. Because sacrifices can be hard to make. But it will all be worth it for Jesus. So, surrender to God's will and ask Him to tell you about your will too. I also have to do that because I also don't know what God has planned for me, but I know that He knows what He's doing. So just trust in Him and know that He knows what He's doing. And surrender to His will, because the sacrifices you make to surrender to His will always be worth it. We should follow the example of Jesus and not let personal will triumph over God's divine purpose. Do not let fear do that. Do not let fear scare you from following God's will. God loves you, God bless you, and I pray that you understood what I said in this video too. Because, yeah, God loves you and God bless you. I love you very much as well.